I'm Dr. Milt Cernett, historian of the United Methodist Church here in Cazenovia, and we are at the corner of Lincoln and Seminary Street at the Methodist Church. We are in the historic district of Cazenovia, and we want to tell a bit about the history of the church, and then later on there will be more about the history of the historic bell, and especially the clock and the clock faces. The particular structure you're looking at was built in 1872. It's known as the Yellow Brick Church, but it replaced an older church called the Old Stone Church, which goes back to the 1830s. Methodists were here in Cazenovia as early as 1816. Initially, they had difficulty in finding a place to worship. Eventually, they worshiped in what was the Madison County Courthouse, the old Madison County Courthouse. That is now part of the Cazenovia College campus. When the courthouse moved to Morrisville, the Methodists outbid the Baptists to obtain the courthouse. That became then the chapel, the first building of the college, or Genesee Conference Seminary as was known then. And eventually that was transferred to the college when the college was formally organized a few years later. The Methodists knew they wanted to have their own church, so in the 1830s they built an old stone church which faced what is now the post office. After 4 decades, 40 years of use, they decided to tear that down, and in the summer of 1873 they laid the cornerstone for the Yellow Brick Church. The stone itself, the bricks, were located here in a quarry in Cazenovia, and that church, which is, as I said earlier, part of the historic landscape or district here in Cazenovia, is also the location of the historic clock, which is our community clock. So this is an effort to try to restore the community clock and the faces for the benefit of everyone. Here we have a picture of the Methodist Church, an older picture showing the tower with the clock in it. There were originally 2 towers with 2 spires on the Methodist Church. Here is the tower as it looked with the spire. Sometime, I believe in the 1950s, the spires were taken down. There was some concern that with the high winds that they seemed to be moving in the winds and there might be some issue of their structural safety. So they were taken down, and there's a flat roof up there now. But fortunately, the bell and the clock, which are inside the tallest of the 2 towers, remain, and that is the chief historical interest today. Here we have the cornerstone of the Old Stone Church, as it was known, erected AD 1832. That church, which was torn down in 1872, was made very solidly. The story is that the men tried to pull down the western wall with ropes and failed to do so. They had to take it apart brick by brick. But this is the perhaps one of the greatest historical links to the original stone church. We'll show you a picture of that in just a minute. This image is of the old stone church, which faced east towards the present-day post office. And again, for 4 decades, this was the place of worship, but the congregation found eventually that it was both too small and outdated. So the Yellow Brick Church was built here. Now you can clearly see the 2 towers, again, missing the spires. Here's the spire again on the taller of the 2 towers. This is the face of the church, the orientation that faces the college today. Here is an interior shot of the present sanctuary, and another one here. There has been over the years extensive remodeling and redesigning of the sanctuary. We are in the sanctuary, our main place of worship of the Methodist Church. We should also say we share this worship space with the Summit Church, a Baptist community, and we have found that to be a very, very good relationship. The configuration of the pews is probably different than some of the older members might remember. I'm told that at one time they said that 1,000 people could be seated in the church. The balcony itself is quite extensive.
Good afternoon. My name is Russ Oshel. I've been involved in researching Cazenovia tower clock makers for about 30 years. And so apparently I'm the only person they could find on this given day to talk about the wonderful clock that's here in the Cazenovia Methodist Church. We'll give you some of the history of the clock as we go along, but just let me say in preface that we are extremely privileged, in my opinion, to have this artifact here in the Cazenovia community. It was made here around 1859. It represents what was a flourishing tower clock industry, and it really was an industry that lasted from about at least 1820 through about 1875, with 6 or 7 different manufacturers during that period. The maker of this clock, Austin Van Riper, was right in the middle of that arc, if you will, as well as his mechanics, Justice Marshall and Samuel Stone, who succeeded him. The Cazenovia Church is sort of typical in terms of access to the tower clock. It's always sort of an adventure. If anything, this is a bit more urbane approach to the tower clock as compared with some of the other churches that you might enter into. If you ever have the wonderful opportunity to go see the clocks, often you have to walk across beams and take leaps across to get to wooden stairways that are a little rickety. This one, as we'll see, is absolutely an adventure, but in a lot better shape than most. So come on with us and let's explore the wonderful Austin Van Riper clock here in the Cazenovia Methodist Church. Okay, coming up the steps from the sanctuary to our first platform, if you will. You can notice a couple things. We talked downstairs about the weight channels and how you could tell where they were in the lobby. These are the hollow weight channels to bring the weights from the clock level down to the main entranceway. Probably a drop of about 65 feet or so. The time weight probably weighs about 150, 175 pounds. Not real sophisticated. It's a wooden box about yay high, and it's full of rocks and sand. Basically, they could add rocks till they had the right amount of weight to run the clock. You don't want to have too much weight or it'll cause more wear on the clock, and the strike weight is probably 250 pounds. And this is the doorway to the wonderful stairway that goes up at about a 45-degree angle, as we'll see, to get up to the next level, not quite the clock level. And you'll notice this rope hanging down. This is the rope that's tied to the bell up above, so when the church services start, they can ring the bell from down here, which is probably about 60 feet below the bell level. As we continue up this lovely staircase, I guess it's a challenge for an architect to build a staircase that goes up into a tower like this. You could put sort of a circular arrangement, I suppose, or just have a nice 45-degree angle with a loose metal railing on the side. All right, so we're on our way to the clock mechanism. So we come around this corner, and this tape is designed so normal people don't have to do this. But one interesting aspect of this is when the railing goes away and the last 6 feet of the shaft go down, and so you want to stick close to the left-hand side of this wall. So we're about to enter the space that has the pendulum and the weight cables. So we've made it up our 45-degree stairway into this next level, and here we have a couple interesting features of the clock. Notice these cables coming down onto pulleys and then shooting back up to the side. These are the cables that come off the clock mechanism up above, which we'll see in a few minutes. This one would be the cable that comes off the time side of the mechanism, and this is the cable that comes off the strike side. So the weight pulls down from the movement and then goes back up to the next level, another pulley, and that pulley connects to the shafts, the weight shafts that we talked about earlier that come down. And the weight shafts are in each of the corners of this room. The other feature that we notice in front of us is the pendulum. This pendulum is about 16 feet long. The cast iron pendulum bob on the bottom probably weighs about 60 pounds. And obviously, like any clock, this swings back and forth while the clock mechanism runs. The clock isn't running at the moment. We'll talk about that more as we go on. Clock needs some repair. That's the effort of the Cazenovia Clock Foundation, of course. But this is all original as it was installed here around 1873-74 in this church. Directly to my right, we talked about this earlier, way down at the bottom of the church, this is the weight channel for the time side weight, and we saw when we came down to the bottom at the entryway where the bottom of these shafts go, and of course about 10 feet, 15 feet to the other side is the weight channel for the strike side of the clock. Okay, so I'm on my hands and knees bowing towards what really is one of the most beautiful tower clocks ever made in the United States, and it's wonderful to think about the fact that this was made right here in Cazenovia on a factory site that's right down the hill from the church. Today it's the site of Bouyer's Hardware. There are still some of the original buildings there that Van Riper used in what he called his Empire Works, where he made tower clocks. He had a sawmill, a grist mill, etc. It was quite an operation, and it lasted from about 1852 to when he died at the end of 1859. This was the best clock he ever made. He made two of these. He made them in 1859, and as time proved, it was sort of his last major effort. He became ill in 1858. He actually, in that year, negotiated with two of his workers, Justice Marshall and Samuel Stone, and arranged to sell over a period of time the tower clock operation to Stone and Marshall. He retained ownership until they had basically bought the firm. He did this because he fell ill in 1858 while on a trip south. It sounds from the historical record that he might have had cancer. He was in remission several times. He felt much better in 1859, and you just wonder whether he produced this thinking that maybe it was one of his final efforts. The one clock that did sell originally was sold to the city of Nashville, Tennessee. It was sold for almost $2,000, which was 4 times the normal price of a Van Riper clock. This has many incredible features that aren't found on any of his other clocks, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But this is the view of the clock when you come up the steps. This is what's called a duplex movement, and basically that means the time mechanism is separated from the strike mechanism. A couple reasons for this. One, a practical reason, if a church only wanted a clock that told the time but didn't chime, which would have been a little unusual, but at least there was that option. They could just sell them the time mechanism. The other thing in terms of accuracy was when both the time and strike gearing are within the same plates, the strike mechanism has drop-off arms that create a lot of vibrations, and if the effort is to make the clock as accurate as possible, which Van Riper was trying to do here, then it's a good idea to separate the strike mechanism so the vibrations affect the time mechanism as little as possible. On the back of the box that supports the time mechanism, and this arrangement was very typical of Van Riper, starting about 1855, his first movements had the time and strike trains within the same set of plates, sort of the same arrangement with the gears in front with the weight barrels coming out the back. First two models, by about 1855, he started to develop these duplex movements. The first one was probably made for the Baptist Church in Saratoga, New York, that we've documented, but all his movements after 1855 were these duplex mechanisms. The difference between this and the other ones is something that we'll look at when we go around the front of the movement. But as I said, on the back of this box, there's some very interesting inscriptions. Now, as we talked before, this clock actually moved from the old stone church to this church in 1874. It was installed in the stone church about 1863. So they had to move it, and the people that moved it put their names on the box. So it says MEC and SL, which they explain as Simeon Lindsay, architect, not sure what that means. M.E. Card, this is Milton E. Card, engineer. J.W. Marshall, we talked about Justice Marshall, in Stone and Marshall, maker, so he's attributed the maker of the clock. We'll talk about that in a little bit. January 1874. Milton E. Card joined Stone and Marshall about 1870. So they operated from after Van Riper died in 1859 to about 1870 as Stone and Marshall. And they made clocks that looked a lot like these but weren't nearly as large during that period. Again, duplex movements, so those are Stone and Marshall movements. In 1870, Card joined the firm. It was officially called Stone, Marshall and Card. And their entire clockmaking operation was over by 1875 when they got into other things. So this records the date when this clock was put in this tower. Okay, so we're now around the front of the clock. We have a bit of an impediment in terms of this ladder, but we can see the mechanism. One thing you'll notice are the decorations on the clock and the color of the clock. It's hard to see now. Well, you can actually see sort of there. The edges of the swirls were painted gold. The basic part of the mechanism itself was painted this reddish brown color. And there's pinstriping that they added to show the decorative curves and lines of this beautiful movement. And one of the questions you think about is, well, here's a clock up 85 feet up in this tower that maybe a few hundred people have actually looked at over the last 150 years or so. Why would you go to all the trouble to decorate the clock so nicely? And I think the answer is it's merely a source of pride, an indication of pride on the part of the makers who made this incredibly beautiful movement, that they wanted it to look as good as possible, and simply painting it black or a single color simply wouldn't have done that. So to the people making these clocks, these were works of art. And when you look at the delicacy of the mechanism and how finely cut these teeth are, and you think this was made in Cazenovia in 1859, it's simply remarkable, the type of workmanship that they did. Couple things. This is the top of the pendulum, and this is what they call a rating nut up here. If you want to adjust the pendulum up and down, you simply turn this to the right and left, and it slightly pulls the pendulum up and down. This is how you can make fine adjustments to the mechanism. Couple of the features that this clock has that most of the others don't. This is called the verge. It's got beautiful detailed casting on it, as you can see. At the end of the verge are what are called the pallets. The pallet is what intersects the escape wheel, this pointed tooth wheel here. These pallets are adjustable. You can see the little bolts here that go through. You can loosen those and move the pallets back and forth to make an adjustment. And these pallets are made out of stone. This is an agate stone. It's a semi-precious stone, and it's extremely durable. And if there was a chip or something in it, you could actually file it down. This is a very, very unusual feature to have basically a semi-precious stone as the pallet. Another thing Van Riper put on these clocks that were on no other clocks, and I'm actually not sure how many clocks made in the United States I've ever seen this on, but if you notice where these are called arbors, basically the arms that carry the gears, where the arbors come through the plates, it's called a pivot, and where the pivot comes through the plate is where you oil it to make the clock run most effectively. So you oil the pivots, and you can see the pivot there. What he installed on all of the pivots on this clock are jeweled dust covers. You can see the screw threads, handmade screw threads with a again another semi-precious jewel, ruby looking jewel, and he made these, and notice how much cleaner the end of this plate is than the rest of the mechanism. So these are doing an incredible job. Why put a semi-precious stone on your dust cover? Again, obviously Van Riper intended these to be the epitome of his clockmaking talent. Now, we noticed on the box that it said that Justice Marshall was the maker. We can certainly attribute the making of this clock to Van Riper and his two primary workmen, Justice Marshall and Samuel Stone. And you can debate back and forth. Obviously, they were his mechanics, but the design of these mechanisms and the many improvements that were made over the years, in my opinion, are clearly attributable to Van Riper, certainly with the help of Stone and Marshall. When this clock was sold to the village of Cazenovia, wasn't until about until about 1863 or 4. So Van Riper had been dead for 3 or 4 years, and Marshall and Stone were running the factory, and they sold the clock. So there's a little confusion as to the maker or who to attribute it to, but clearly it's a Van Riper clock made while he owned the company, and obviously Stone and Marshall had a hand in its construction. So as we turn the corner to look at the front of the movement, I just have always found this to be really humorous. We saw the stenciling on the lower box on the time mechanism. So you come around, this is actually an air shaft that comes out of the sanctuary, and they stenciled on the side, "Write no names." So they knew that it was basically human nature, if you made it this far up in the tower, to put your name on something. So they put "Write no names" on this piece of wood, which of course it's human nature that if you're up here, that's exactly where you're going to put your name. So notice all the names inscribed over the years around the sign that says "Write no names." So when we talked about the time mechanism, this is an extremely accurate timekeeper, probably one of the most accurate tower clocks made in the United States in the middle 1800s. We talked about how the movements were separated to take the vibrations off of the time mechanism itself, and this large piece of decorated cast iron is the strike mechanism, and as you can notice, it's actually much larger than the time mechanism. The weight on the strike mechanism is probably twice as heavy as that on the time mechanism. They needed the force to pull down this cable that went all the way up to the bell and rang the bell. Couple little different things about the strike mechanism. Most strike mechanisms on clocks have a slight delay. A hand raises an arm, and that sets the clock for the strike. So when the hand goes a few minutes further, another hand drops into a slot, and off it goes. Van Riper's strikes have no delay on them. You have a little arm that comes off the movement. When that little arm comes off a cam and pulls it up and then drops, away goes the strike. So this is always fun. So we'll let it go and see if we hear it striking up above. So, a neat process. And of course, I think, in my opinion, it's obligatory whenever you're up in a clock tower to make sure you at least ring the bell a few times, wake up a few people in town, especially if the bell hasn't gone off in a while, and make them wonder what the heck is going on. And think about it, these clocks, when they were put into these towers, it was in a time and day when, nobody had wristwatches except the wealthiest people. Around in 1859, there might have been a couple companies in the United States actually making watches all by hand, but most of the watches were imported from Europe, so it was an expensive proposition. So if you were walking around town, running a business, running a farm, you depended upon this clock and this strike to tell you what time of day it was. And even if it wasn't accurate to say the time in Syracuse, it was Cazenovia time, and that really ordered life during that period. And the towns and villages that could afford a clock, that was a sign of prosperity and civic mindedness in its day. In our day and age, nobody's used to winding clock mechanisms of any sort. You don't wind your wristwatch, they do it automatically, or they're electric. You don't wind your clocks at the house, they're electric. If you even have a clock, you pull your cell phone out to tell you what time it is. These clocks were wound once every 8 days. That's how they basically determined how far down the weights had to go in the building. And so once a week, somebody had to come up and wind these. Basically, they put the crank on the end of that shaft and pull away. And it's not all that easy to do. They are compounded, so that adds to the amount of weight. Originally, this was a positioned clock winder of great importance in the village. They actually hired a person each year. It might have been $10 a year, but in any case, it was a prestigious position because you were keeping the time for the entire village. Probably by about the turn of the century, it got a little harder to find people to do it. And frankly, in the last 30 years or so, and this clock in this church is a good example, I think they've had 4 or 5 different people, and it usually works out well for maybe 8 or 9 months or so until that nice person wants to go on vacation and you can never find anybody else to wind it. So these clocks go into disuse. And I've worked on this clock 3 times over the last 30 years, and in each time the clock had been let go and not running for a period of 3 or 4 years, and or the pigeons have gotten in and so on. So this sort of cycle continues. There are ways to electrify the winding mechanisms. On a clock like this would be very difficult, and the people who have done it over the last 50 years usually have wrecked the clocks in the process. So it's part of the equation. You have to find somebody in this day and age to actually wind these clocks, and that gets very, very difficult. Okay, so from the clock level, we have 1, 2, 3 more levels to go. One of the things you notice as we come up is this, the wooden vertical or horizontal shaft that I mentioned earlier. This takes the power from the clock up another 40 feet to the dial, and we'll see those in a minute. So we come up to this platform, turn the corner, a couple years and 20 more pounds, you won't be able to do this, and then up the next set of steps to the bell level. And when we get here, we have to go through this trap door. And to get to the bell level, we go through this wonderful trap door, which is a nice heavy piece of wood coated with, looks like copper. As we talked about, this is the open air area of the tower. And quite often pigeons get in here, and I know that they spent a lot of time a few months back getting the pigeons out, but as I look around, I think we've got more pigeons in the tower. So obviously they're still getting in. But this door and this covering is designed to make sure that the pigeons don't get any further down into the church, because if they did, then there'd be more pigeon droppings all over the lower areas as well as the upper areas. So our next to the last adventure involves the bell level of the tower. As you can see, this is sort of open air. It's got chicken wire on the inside of the slats here. But obviously, as we've seen from some of our friends hanging around in the rafters here, the pigeons have gotten in again. They'll have to work on that. But in any case, they put the bell level where the sound can get out of the tower. That's why this is an open air area. And as we noted earlier, when we had the clock strike, it strikes on this beautiful bell. Talk about the bell just for a second. This bell was made in 1839 in West Troy, New York, which is just across the river from Troy. It's now Watervliet, called Watervliet. West Troy at the time was a real center of bell making, and the leading bell maker in the entire East Coast was a guy named Andrew Meneely, who started his foundry in 1826. This bell's dated 1839. Probably not the first bell in the original church, which was erected in 1832. Lots of times the bells cracked and they had to order new bells. This was actually made at that point by the firm of Meneely and Uthout. Meneely had a partner named Jonas Uthout for only about 5 years during that period. It's a wonderful bell. We heard it before, but we didn't hear it right up close, so we have our earmuffs on here, right? And so we've proven that you can hear the bell from 2 feet as well as 2 miles here in Cazenovia. Okay, so the final step on our journey up the tower, and we're probably about 80 feet up now, is the level where the gearbox is. We've talked about how the wooden shaft comes up from the movement, comes all the way up to the dial level, and up there's a bevel gear on the top of this shaft. That turns 4 other bevel gears in a little gearbox, which we'll see in a second. So that's where the dials are, up at the very top level. And as we've talked about, the movement itself is probably 40 to 50 feet below us. So up we go, the final ladder, thank goodness. And interestingly enough, as we've seen, we've encountered some wonderful pigeon friends here in the tower. That's a common problem in these towers. If you don't keep the pigeons out, within a year or so, the pigeon poop will be 6 inches to a foot deep. So here we go. All right, so up we go into the room where the dead pigeons have arrived since the last time they cleaned this, which was only a few months ago. So it's sort of a situation you have to take care of every season to avoid the pigeons getting back up into the tower. So last step of our journey, you see a box here, and you see these shafts coming out from the center. This box basically is to keep the pigeon droppings off the gearbox. So this is the gearbox. You see the bevel gear attached to the horizontal shaft, the takeoff shaft that comes up from the movement. As that moves, all 4 of these bevel gears turn, transmitting the power out to the dials. These are geared, so this is basically the minute wheel that these shafts turn, and then there's gearing on the back of the dials that convert the minute wheel into the hour wheel, and then the hands secure onto that shaft outside of the dial. Now we can't see it now because the dials are closed up while the renovation's going on, but there are little trap doors built into the dials. You can open the trap doors from the inside, and they're almost big enough, if your head isn't too large, to stick your head out and actually adjust the hands or take the hands on and off from the outside. So that concludes our journey up the Cazenovia tower clock tower. I've hoped you've had a lot of fun. I know the cameramen have. And hopefully this project will get this clock up and running again and serving as a major part of the history of Cazenovia.